Okay, so I'm here to tell you about stuff in CSS Fonts 4, primarily. How many people here have used... Oh my God. Whoa. How many people here have used a web font on a website? Okay, how many people haven't? Yeah. How many people feel they've used it to its full potential? Okay, you will learn something, I hope. So yeah, this is me, and I can skip over this because we already did this, so yeah, topics for today. First of all, some basics. Oh, come on. I think there's a loose connection somewhere. I'm not jumping around that much. Whoa.
Okay, and now?
Is that better? I will try not to deafen you. Okay, so first of all, some basics, just to make sure we're all talking the same language. And then I'm going to talk about variable fonts, and then color fonts. And lastly, I'm going to wind up with some of the old stuff, in other words, CSS3 OpenType features. So let's get going. First of all, a character. What is a character? It's actually just a number. It's a code point in Unicode. But as well as just a number, like an A is 65, this sort of thing, it also has some properties. For example, A is a capital letter, and it's not punctuation, and it's not a number. So these sorts of things altogether as a bundle of properties defines a character. As opposed to a glyph. A glyph is the visual representation. It's what you see on a web page, it's what you see in print. You can have characters without glyphs. For example, if you happen to be blind and you're using a text-to-speech converter, you're having the characters read to you and converted to audio, but then you're not using glyphs. Okay, just to make sure you're all paying attention. What is this on screen? What is it? It is a ligature, that's the bonus question. It is, however, what we can see is a glyph. How many characters is it? Yeah, these are both good answers. It should be 2 characters. There is a single character to FI, and you should not use it because otherwise search will never find it. You used to have to do it, it was the only way to get the ligature, but now you just type the 2 characters together and it works. So it's 1 glyph but 2 characters. Another one. This is how many characters? 1 probably, or 2. It could also be a combining accent. And it is hopefully 1 glyph, otherwise the results will look hideous. And hopefully it only comes from 1 font, but in the worst possible case it comes from 2 fonts and looks terrible. Some more terminology. Here are some fonts. Myriad Pro is an example of a font family. And these light Roman, bold, etc. are faces, and similarly for Baskerville. So we have the idea of a family of related fonts which are gathered together. They have a family name and they have members. And lastly, descriptors. I'm sure you all know what a font property is, like you've gone font weight bold and something and not thought much of it. But you've probably also seen that inside an app font face and wondered if it was kind of the same thing or almost the same thing or totally different. So a descriptor tells you what a font can do. A property says, I want this text displayed using this combination of font properties. It's a request for how you want it styled. So here's an example. We have a font family, which appears twice, once in a descriptor and once as a property. And also we have a font weight. So the descriptor is saying this particular font, when you download it, is bold. And the H1 styling says, I want H1s to be bold, and I want them to be in this family, and therefore it will match. All clear?
Yes.
Not you. All clear? Yes, good. Good, excellent. Font stacks. So you don't typically use just a single font. You use a bunch of them in a list. Why would you do that? For example, you might have one for Latin, you might have one for Cyrillic, and these happen to be in different fonts, so you bring them together. And the first font that A exists and B actually has glyphs for the characters you're trying to display is the one that gets used. And that means that if you have a run of mixed language text, you might be using different fonts in your stack depending on what the language is. How many people have ever had an email from a Japanese developer in English and thought, why is it using such a hideous font? And the reason is because it's probably selecting a Japanese font, which happens to have Latin glyphs, which look terrible because they don't really see them. So the typical thing you would do in CSS to fix that is you would put the Latin ones first and the Japanese ones second, and then that means you get nice Latin glyphs. Amazing. Until some clever developer says, hey, this Latin font, I like to work on it a bit more. I'm going to add 1 or 2 Japanese characters to this font. You can't have them both first. There has to be some way to resolve this conflict. Any ideas how we resolve it, by the way, before I go on? You were talking about this at lunch. Unicode range. What it tells you is, given this font, which I've already downloaded, I want you to use these bits of it. Like, I want you to use the Cyrillic glyphs from this font, but I don't want you to use the Arabic glyphs because I don't like them or whatever. It does not subset it. Some people think that when you put Unicode range on, it somehow tells the server and it gives you a we wish, but no, that's not what it does. So here's an example. I've got a Japanese font and I'm using a Unicode range. If you look at these numbers, you can obviously tell that this is the yen symbol, then it's kanji, and then it's hiragana, and then it's katakana. Just looking at the numbers, it's obvious, right? I must apologize. I am personally responsible for this syntax. Unicode was very new at the time. Everyone wrote it with a U+ to show that they were talking about Unicode. And I thought that hex ranges like this would be okay, and I proposed it on a mailing list, and nobody said anything wrong. And I said, if nobody says something, this is what we're going to have in the spec. And nobody said anything, so we put it in the spec, and it's now 25 years later, and it's too late to change it, so sorry. Okay, here's an example. We want to have a nice swishy ampersand, and it comes from a different font. So 26 is the Unicode number for the ampersand, and we want to just use that. So here's an example. So we've got a font face set up which uses a nice swishy thing, and we'll add it at the beginning. And suddenly just the ampersand changes. And if we were to get rid of this Unicode range, then all of it would be used. You see what's happening there? It's being matched first, and then the only thing it matches is the ampersand, so everything else uses the next font in the list. Okay, that's the basics over and done with. Let's look at variable fonts next. How many people have heard of variable fonts? Nice. So this is the situation as it has existed for a long time in, for example, print, where you don't have to worry about things like download size. So here's a font family, quite a large one. It has condensed, it has expanded, it has thin weights, it has thick weights in between, and it's 37 files. Now that's fine in print, you just embed it all in the PDF, send it over to the printer or courier or wherever, it gets printed and you're done. But on WebFonts, that's 37 font faces and 37 downloads, and it's probably a bit heavy. Now with variable fonts, the idea is you download one variable font and it has what's called design axes, and you interpolate along them. When people first hear about this, they think, oh, this is never going to catch on because this is sounds like you have to redesign your fonts from scratch. Yeah, you kind of do, except that in practice, font designers were already doing this, right? They were already using software to create masters and interpolate between them. They didn't lovingly handcraft every little curve. They sort of tweaked them a bit. And then what they had to do was then spit out all the different instances so they could actually be used. Variable font says, let's cut out that step. Let's just ship effectively the design master. So here's an example. This is new in OpenType 1.8. So here's a letter Q, and it's a somewhat bold one. And here are two letter Qs, one of which is thinner than the other. And if you imagine that since they've carefully lined up all of the points, we just have to give a diff. You say, if you want thin, you move this one over here, and this one over here, and this sort of thing. And this is a smaller thing than drawing two entire Qs, plus it allows you to get any intermediate value by just interpolating the positions. And that's just one axis, that's the weight axis. So there are 5 registered axes. There's italic, which isn't really an axis because something's either italic or it's not. There is optical scaling. In the days when paper was made with actual metal type and you had to buy your type in different sizes, the different designs, they weren't quite the same. The big ones were a bit more ornamental and had more variation between thick and thin, and the tiny ones were more smoothed off and simplified. And this is called optical sizing. You can do it in digital fonts as well, but there was never any good way to how to do that. Then we have slant for oblique fonts, where it's slanted over. The width, in other words, condensed or expanded. And the font weight, how heavy or light it is. So the first way that people trying to experiment using this is causing something called font variation settings. And then you basically give font-specific numbers to it, and you know, because of the font you're using, what those actually mean. This is horrible. Don't do this. There's no reason to. But before we go on, just to make sure everyone's still awake, a question for you. First of all, I set font weight to 400. And then I set it to calc 9 times 100. Multiple choice question. Is it A, 400, or B, 900? Hands up for 400. Hands up for 900. That's what you'd expect, right? Hands up for we don't trust you, Chris. This is a trick question. Okay, in font 3, the answer was 400. Because it was a bunch of number-like strings. The allowed values were 100, or 200, or 300. These were not numbers. You couldn't interpolate them, and it didn't matter because the fonts came in these weights anyway, mostly. In CSS 4, it's actually a number, like the OpenType spec says. Between 1 and 999, you can have any value you want. So this is a much better way. This is the high-level way of doing it. You would normally set font weight to, say, 400 for a normal weight, but now you can set it to 362 or any other value that you want. And similarly with a stretch, you can set it to any number you want. Now, previously, there was no value in doing that because unless you happen to have a font that did that, why bother? But now you can get any value along a supported design axis. And font optical scaling, auto. There are 2 values, basically on or off. Auto is on, meaning yes, do optical scaling if it's supported, and the other one is off. If you're doing it at low level, you have to say which size you want, but that's always going to be the same as the font size. So we made it simple. Basically, do you want to use optical scaling or do you not? And that's just summarizing what I just said. So these are the standard design axes. And just to show you an example, I'm going to use a font which has, it's a variable font, and it goes from 300 to 800. Or any value in between. So you just ask for what value you want, and up it comes. And you can obviously animate it and do whatever if you wish. Here's another example. We're animating the weight, we're animating the X height, we're animating something about how round and circular the glyphs are, which is a specialized thing for this font. How do we do this? So the first thing to notice is we look at the descriptors, and they now have 2 numbers. Font weight says 100 space 900, meaning it can do anything between these 2 numbers. The font stretch, anywhere in this font, between 50% and 200%, where 100% is is the normal. And the font style, it can do anything between 10 degrees leaning backwards and 40 degrees leaning forwards. And then when we actually use it, we say we want an oblique font at 24 degrees, and so they all get tilted over at that angle. And we want the font weight to be 234, fairly light, so when we know it can do it. Now here's another example. This is related to the earlier one that I showed you. We also have a radius, in other words, how big and round some of these glyphs can get. This is something that the font designer made up, right? It's a custom axis. They decided they want this thing to have a property of roundness, and they set radius to 0.4. But we could also use a keyframe animation and change radius between a smaller and a large value and get this approach where they get rounder throughout the animation. Continuing with the theme of custom axes, this is a font called Decovar by David Berlow, and it allows you to look at the ends of the characters. Bloop. Actually, the ends of the glyphs. Sorry, I used the wrong term. So we can change them in subtle ways, or in not so subtle ways. We can make a little bit of space in the middle of them and a bit more space at the edges and come up something like that. So this is 4 custom axes that are specific to this font, and you can set them using font variation settings. This is another example. Let me actually show you this animated. There we are. This font has a custom axis of twigginess, and it's being used to put little leaves and twigs around the edges of the glyphs. Lovely. And this font consists of a bunch of rectangles which can be interpolated to do stupid stuff like this. It's a fake pixel font using vectors, just because I thought that was fun. Here's a more serious example. You notice that as this dollar sign gets thicker, the line in the middle starts getting, it's banging in with the rest of the glyph. So at some point we simplify it and we just have it at top and bottom instead. So this is a discontinuous interpolation. Up to a certain point we have the center line and then we drop it. Okay, here I'm illustrating 2 design axes. One is the weight, and the other one is the width, the condensedness. So I've got a normal and I've got a condensed, and the condensed ones are narrower. But also, as you get bolder, it gets wider. So you can see that both boldness and width make it wider. But if we use a careful combination of these axes, like that, we can play one off against the other, so we end up with a constant width regardless of thickness, which is quite nice. You can do copy fitting and things like that. You can say, I want this headline to occupy this amount of space and be as bold as possible, but not go onto another line. You can do things like that. So here's some copy fitting. There's various different aspects of this font, including the spacing between individual glyphs, all being animated together so that it ends up taking a constant amount of space. Jason Parmental wrote that variable fonts may be the most significant change in responsive design since the term responsive design was actually invented. Okay, that's enough for variable fonts. Let's talk about color fonts. I'm sure you all know about these medieval manuscripts, with their colorful illuminated letters done by monks. And let's face it, who as a web developer hasn't wanted to do that in response to customer demand? Okay, maybe not. Maybe you use more that sort of customer demand that we were thinking of. We want to have flags, and we want to have smiling faces and stuff like that. So yes, in response to this, there was a need to add color into fonts. Previously, font was just an outline, and you fill it with whatever color you want. The first ones to do this were Apple and Google, who both chose terrible approaches. They had a little bitmap, and in case you wanted it at different sizes, they had lots of bitmaps. And then you would pick the one, or the system would pick the one for you that the closest matched. And if you got too big, then the actual thing would completely disappear and not display at all, which was terrible. Later ones, which I'll tell you about, actually use vectors like they should. So going back to this is actually a piece of cloth. Nice story. Am I okay for time so far? Can I do an anecdote for a couple of minutes? Good. Okay, so I went to a typography conference about 10 years ago or so, and there was a chap there who'd been around India, where they have this tradition of sign painting. People actually paint on cloth in multiple colors these signs for, fruit stalls or whatever it is. And he thought, this is a dying trade, right? These people are being put out of business by cheap printing and this sort of thing, and all of the signs are now in Arial instead. So he went around to them and said, I want you to design fonts for me. And they said, well, we don't have a computer, what are we going to do? And he said, no, paint them like you do, and I will convert them to fonts. So they did, and they produced stuff like this for him, and he's like, well, it's got more than one color in it. And they were like, yeah, of course it has. That's what it looks like now. And he's like, yeah, but you can't make fonts out of that. So here's an example. It's a web page. It has the font that's actually made from that printed example there. Isn't it cool? No, it's not cool. Look at this. Oh, no. This is the I'm working in Adobe Illustrator design flow. It's like, I'm going to set this text multiple times, and I can put a different font on each one, and set different colors, and slap them all together, and use absolute positioning. Ugh. First of all, your search engine optimization goes out the window, because you're obviously trying to cheat. And secondly, this is not really... This is just careful positioning, and it's going to work for one headline, but really, no, this is a mess. You don't want ever to do that. So, I mentioned that you can now do color vector fonts. So here's an early editor that was used. I actually put these ones all together, gave them all different colors, saved it out again as a color font. So this is the first color format I'm going to tell you about. It's called Color, C-O-L-R. Which is used to hold not just one TrueType outline, but a lot of them. And then you also have a CPAL, which is a color palette, which tells you for each outline what color it's in. It's like an indexed color sort of deal. Like that. Now look at this. This is real text. I can select it. I can decide I'm at a different conference. That's the only time you're going to see CSS and JS from me, let me tell you. Okay, so is this cool? Yes? No, it's not. It's terrible. I told you what I did. I got these fonts, I put them all in a font editor, I set them all to different colors, and I saved it out, and here they are. Well, what if I want different colors? I have to do that all again. This is not how CSS works. The styling went away. So, round two. In CSS4, we have some things. Firstly, fonts often have multiple palettes. For example, if you have dark mode, you might want a light mode palette and a dark mode palette for the same font. Okay, that's not that useful, but also we have this thing called font palette values. This is a new rule, and it lets you override an existing palette, parts of it, all of it, make an entirely new palette, whatever you want. So, and also we're going to use, instead of using TrueType outlines, we're going to use SVG outlines. Now, in case you're confused, this is not SVG fonts, right? Which you have to use like 10 years ago, were horrible and have no internationalization. No, this is an OpenType font, except it has SVG for the glyphs. And then again, the palette, which holds values, but now these values are just the default. You can now override them. Like that. Oh, by the way, on the program, it said I'm from France. I actually work in France, but I'm British, so I can say I love the UK. Well, I don't really. I love Scotland, but actually, instead, since I'm here, there we go. So that one's cool, not just because I changed it to say Ukraine, because it is actually, I can change the colors using styling, and that's the important part. So here's an example, and I can just pick a color, and I can change it, and it changes, and it becomes hideously green, whatever you want. So there we are, that's the basic thing. There's an app palette values. I give it a name, I called it autumnal. I can make it up any name I want, just so I can refer to it. I say which family I'm using and which palette, because it can have more than one palette. If I miss out base palette, that means I'm making up a new palette. And then I can provide the colors. So this, I should point out, is a completely fake demo, which Leah coded up for me in JavaScript. This is in the spec. It hasn't been implemented yet. We're pushing people to implement it, and you know the drill now. If you want to see this thing in your browsers, go to your favorite browser and complain that they don't support it yet. Honestly, it really does work. Going back to variable fonts for a moment, here's an interesting font. It has a single glyph, and it has one design axis, which is called cap height. Get it? Cap height. Okay, so this is just to show you color fonts and variable fonts working together. Nice. So this is a fairly recent addition to the Fonts 4 spec. So you know in an app font face, you can say source and wherever the font is loaded from, and then you can say format. You can say format OpenType or format whatever, and you give a format hint. Well, we've added another thing, which is supports, because with all this new stuff, you probably want a bit of fallback. So here's an example. I've got a link to sample color OpenType, which is of OpenType, and it supports color in the COLR type. And if that doesn't work, in other words, if the browser doesn't support that, I have a fallback to a black and white one, which I want to use instead. Well, black and white, I mean, I can put it in any color I want, but just one color. So supports is new, and what can you do with it? You can see whether you support OpenType features, whether you support variations, whether you support the various types of color, and whether you support color palettes. So for example, if you didn't support color palettes, you might want to download a different font that you've hard-coded different colors into. And since you wouldn't ever want to do that, that's why we need this, because then you can download the font once and recolor it multiple times. Okay, so that's all the new stuff. Now we can kick back and do the boring old stuff, which is actually fairly well supported now, and this is OpenType features. If you ever used desktop publishing software, like InDesign or whatever, you'll probably be familiar with this. People have been using this for like a decade or more. On the web, not so much, but it's getting there now. So here's an example of a fancy font that has some interesting ligatures and stuff. Of course, you wouldn't want to always have that, but sometimes you'd want it on a big headline or something. So OpenType features are optional stylistic controls. They're things which make things nicer, but if they're not supported, it's no biggie. It still looks like just a regular font would look. So this is a progressive enhancement. It's something you can add without worrying that it has to be supported in 100% of all the browsers that you're trying to target. And then there are CSS features to control this OpenType stuff. And fonts vary. So this is another reason that we couldn't have this before. Previously, you could use all these OpenType features, or we could imagine some way of using them, but you don't know what fonts are on the system. You don't know whether they support these features or not. It was only when we had reliable downloadable fonts using WAF that we could actually say, okay, I'm designing this site, I want to use these features, and therefore I'll use this font, which I know supports them, provide the font as well. So it was we had to get there first before we could start using it. Now the syntax that I'm going to use is font variant, which we already had in CSS and CSS1, but it's been extended. It's the preferred way of doing it. The support is improving. There's also a low-level thing which came first called font feature settings. It's hard to read, it's awkward to use, and it's supported everywhere. Take your pick. Actually, now your pick should be the font variant, pretty much. So here's an example. If you look at the numbers, and with the uppercase letters, they go nicely, they all line up. But for the second sentence there are ascenders and descenders on these lowercase letters, but the numbers don't have that, so they don't really seem to line up very well. But if I pick what's called old style numbers, then the numbers also have ascenders and descenders. Now, of course, they don't line up on the top line. You wouldn't use this indiscriminately, you'd use it on particular sections depending on what you want. But this is one CSS rule, very easy to add, nice fallback because you don't lose anything if it's not supported, increases readability. Here's another example. You've probably seen that there are actually characters for like a half, 3/4. Great. Two problems with that. Firstly, if you want to search for things that use a half, like I want a recipe that uses half a teaspoon of cinnamon, you have to type in this special character for a half. You'd really rather type 1/2, right? Because it's searchable. And secondly, what if you want 13/27ths, which, by the way, you're not going to find in Unicode. But instead, we can just, again, set one property to a different value, and they all magically turn into fractions. And again, if it's not supported, fine, you still see the other one. It's readable, it's just less nice. Here's another example. Suppose these were amounts of money, and you had to quickly guess which was the biggest one. Probably the one beginning 8, right? Because 8's bigger than 2 is bigger than 1. But no, because these are proportional, and they don't line up. Now, easy fix, you set it in Courier or something, you set it in monospaced, but then all of your text looks ugly. What we want to have is nicely designed, but fixed width numbers, which we get like that, by saying we want tabular numbers. And then suddenly they all line up. Another example, ordinals. We want first, second, third, but these are not normally written like that. They're written like this. So again, setting one property, it looks more readable, it's nicer. And you're probably looking at that and going, yeah, Chris, but that's in English. And you're cheating really, aren't you? So let's do it in French as well. Okay, good. No cheating. And going back to the font that I showed at the beginning of this section, here it is with the normal setting. And here it is with the fancy ligatures. So we've got an RO and an LE. Makes it look nicer. And we can also switch all the ligatures off, including the ones that are on by default. Notice now the FL just went to two things which are banging into each other. You wouldn't typically want to do this, but it exists should you need to. So, have you ever noticed if you link to a single font from your website and then you merrily use bold and italic, it works, right? Even though you didn't actually link to a bold or an italic font. And that is because the browser is behind the scenes making your font a bit bolder or sliding it over to simulate an oblique. Font designers hate this because they took a nice, well-designed font and mess it up. So now there is a way to say, I don't want you to do that, like that. I can say none. Don't synthesize bold. Don't synthesize italic. Let's see a good example of why you would really want to do that. Yeah, there we are. There's a nice swishy thing with the font synthesis switched off, but in the default value, oh no, we've got a fake bold, and even worse, we have a slanted italic version of the already italic face, which any designers here are trying not to throw up at this point. So that lets you prevent using font synthesis. New in CSS4, by the way, is the ability to stop it doing fake small caps as well. Lastly, let's see, font kerning and letter spacing. So do people know what kerning is? Yes, generally? Okay, good. Kerning is how you take two glyphs and you put them together so that it looks visually as if they have a similar spacing. And letter spacing is putting a fixed amount of spacing between all of them. So the initial value, the web-compatible value is auto, and I can set it to normal, which does nothing here because this is Firefox and it does that by default. There are some browsers that unwisely switch off kerning on the belief that it is faster, and it isn't anymore, but they do it anyway. And then I can set it to none. You can see between the V and the A, for example, it looks too wide now because it's a fixed width. And then there's letter spacing, so I can add a little bit more space. Or a bit less space, or actually make it go back. You don't ever do that, don't. So those of you with long memories will remember that about 10 minutes ago, I told you not to use the low-level features, use the high-level ones instead. That's fine if it's supported, but there are cases where it's not. So in this case, for example, we have a chemical equation, and it doesn't read very nicely because the numbers are down below. Sorry, they're all on the same line. So we can actually set what's called scientific inferiors. Sorry. Which automatically switches the numbers down like this, so it's a more readable equation. So again, this is a fairly good fallback. If it's not supported, you'll still get the original version. It's not like you lose the numbers or anything. So this is the sort of thing that you should use font feature settings for, if a particular font has some custom thing and you want to use it. So by now you're probably thinking, how do I know? If I have a font, do I read documentation? We're developers, we don't read documentation, right? So instead, there's this amazing website, which, let me get it there. And find a font. There. And you just drop the font on this. It's not uploaded to a server. This is all client-side JavaScript. And it tells you this is a true type font, it's color, it has this many characters, it uses SVG glyphs, it has one layout feature, etc. Let me find another one that's better. Okay, that one. Stop it. So this is a variable font. It has one axis, which is and now, honestly, this is the last slide, don't worry. So this tells me that it has 9 named instances, it has one axis, etc. So this is a great website. It's called Wacamai Fondue, which is a pun on what can my font do. You basically drop a font on it and it tells you all the stuff that it can do, and even better, it gives you CSS that you can just drop in to use each of the features, so you can just copy and paste it. This is a great site. Great for exploring what fonts can do, great for making demos like I made here. And I believe that was my last slide, so you can stop the crackling. Yes. Okay.
Just one question. Probably everything is clear and very interesting, as for me. So, what is the best way to using custom fonts in emails?
Using fonts. Is this on? Yes. No? Yes? Are we going?
1, 2.
The best way to use fonts in emails is to go forward to the year 2057, when they will finally have stopped using Microsoft Word to render emails on Windows.
Thank you. And one question from me. I noticed that you used a few times the expression CSS4, but Leah said a few times that it is a buzzword and we shouldn't use these expressions. So can you say something?
Okay, so in the beginning it was CSS1, and then there was CSS2, which had lots of features that didn't get implemented. So we then had CSS 2.1, which took all those out. And then we made CSS3, where we took the CSS 2.1 spec and cut it into lots of pieces and worked on them all individually. None of them got finished. So we stopped doing that, and instead we made what were called modules, which were called level 3, and they based themselves off 2.1. So they're like a diff, a patch. It's like, read 2.1 spec, except now you can do these extra things. This worked well for a while, until one of them was shipped, and we couldn't change it anymore, but we still wanted to add new features. So then we produced level 4 modules. But then, of course, we wanted to add a new feature that wasn't in CSS previously at all, and calling it 4 or 3 or something was kind of stupid, so we called it 1 because it was the first version of that module. So actually, when I'm using numbers like this, I mean the revision number of that module. There is no such thing as CSS3. There will never be a spec called CSS3, the complete edition, everything you need to know about CSS. But every year or so, we publish a thing called a snapshot, which basically lists, this is what we think CSS is this year. It's 2.1 plus these modules, which are all pretty much done, and then these modules which you can use with caution, and then there's these ones which will be ready next year maybe, but you should keep an eye on them, but don't use them in production. So this snapshot effectively defines, so if you go to the W3C website and you go to technical reports page /CSS, that's what you'll get, the latest yearly snapshot.
Thank you very much.